you so much, Kieran, for joining me today. It's an absolute privilege and pleasure to have you speak about this very, very, very important book, especially in the world that we're living in right now. So, thank you, first of all.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, but without further ado, I'll just do a quick introduction, which is Kieran Yates is a journalist, broadcaster, and author who writes regularly on youth culture, housing, immigration, and politics for publications including The Guardian, The Independent, and Vice. She recently produced the BBC Radio 4 documentary Estate Music, which explored the link between music, immigrant communities in the UK, and social housing. So, All the Houses I've Ever Lived In is her first solo book. So, of course, I've got to ask, which is, what was it like writing your story about living in 25 different homes?
Well, I found it, it was challenging, as writing about ourselves often is. But it was also, it was like a forced revisiting of a certain kind of past. So I've thought of my past as something that was filled with various kind of pop culture injections, like Missy Elliott and, growing up on
Mhm,
Bollywood and, you know, our political
mhm,
reckoning and, my siblings and like food and fun and school. And moving from place to place was just kind of a normal thing that people do. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that some of my experiences were quite unusual. And, in the writing of this book, I both realized how disruptive so much of my early experiences were, and continue to be throughout my adult life as well. And so there was a little bit of like me reckoning with that part of my life that I'd kind of just shrugged off,
mm.
By the time I was in my 20s and I would move to so many places, I was right on the hard edge of the recession, like lots of my peers were. And, in my mind, moving from private rental accommodation to private rental accommodation was just
Yeah.
normal. Rents escalate, you get no fault evictions, you are served, that this is just the part and parcel of life. And in the writing of this book, I realized that no, this is not part of parcel. These are not the terms that we should be forced to
Yeah.
accept. And so it was like, yeah, it was re-looking at my life through the lens of reality and justice.
Yeah, it was so traumatizing even when you read it because I think, as you say, you don't realize it when it's happening. You're just kind of living. But we know that housing is a human right. So, how is housing a justice and political issue? And what is the importance of shelter?
Well, I've lived in lots of different places, obviously, and they've all taught me something about home. But, even in the writing in this book, the sort of landscape of housing has got worse
Yeah.
because our economic backdrop has got worse. We are experiencing pay freezes. We are experiencing gender and ethnic pay gaps, which obviously lead to housing gaps. The housing crisis has become a public health
Mm.
emergency. So, my story is now the story of the 17.5 million people in the UK who do not have secure, stable, and safe housing. So, the things that I'm writing about is increasingly the experience of lots and lots of people. I haven't experienced all the hardest edge of housing, like street homelessness, but I have known what it means to be in temporary accommodation, to have your estate, facing
Mm.
demolition, to live in places not designed to be lived in, to, live on your own and be in receipt of benefits. And that's before, going to student accommodation and living in mold filled homes and, all of those kinds of things. So, you know, in my view, housing is the thing that all the other issues in our society orbits around. And it's imperative that we act on making that safe and secure and accessible to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into more of the nitty gritty, I was really curious because there was something so beautiful about it, and it just reminded me so much of home as well, which was all the personal and linking objects. And so, how important were they to you? Because having like the gold encrusted tissue box, which obviously reminds you of home and things like that. But how important was it for you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is a book about moving. So, as much as it's about moving from place to place, it's also about the things that we bring with us and the things that we leave behind. And the things that we bring with us become more sentimental and become more meaningful because, they turn into things that have followed you within
Mhm.
5 house moves and then 10 house moves and then more and more. And so I write about the kind of nostalgic relationship I have to a fake gold plastic tissue box, which, you might have seen in lots of
Yeah.
Punjabi houses, certainly across
Mhm.
the South Asian diaspora. And, I talk a little bit about the cultural history of how these came to get into Britain, but, you know, they, there is no clear year zero, but a lot of them originated in India during the Mughal Empire and then moved through and basically made their way here to various houses, various high streets for like a fiver you can get from the local market. But they speak to this idea of opulence. They speak to a historical idea of, the Indian relationship with
Mm.
gold. And they also speak to sharing networks. There's a reason why lots of immigrant communities have uniform
Yeah.
aesthetics. And it's because there were these sharing networks where you'd come to the UK for the first time and people would give you a tablecloth, and they give you the same plastic
Mm.
tablecloth, and they give you these things, and you start to realize these details, and you understand that the objects that we bring with us have a clear link to our migration history.
Oh, that's so strange. It just sort of brought me back several memories as you were talking about that. I was like, yes, I remember certain objects in like family houses or like aunties and uncles' houses that just seem to be migrating across like different houses.
Yeah, completely. It's like, how do we kind of keep these linkages and these connections with places that we migrated from? And that's one of the ways that we do that,
Yeah.
right? And it kind of, in the book, it leads me to talking about how the history of housing activism in this UK, especially in its immigrant communities, is so rich. And thanks to those very early fights that were fought in the 1970s in, Black, West African, Caribbean, communities and in South Asian communities, we are able to exist as we exist today. So, we have much to be sort of in gratitude for.
Yeah, do you know, as you said that, it brought me to the next point, which is the community savings scheme, and obviously all these communities that people paid into a common fund over like several weeks or months. And why don't we have these kind of partners anymore?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, a what we're referring to is what's known as a mortgage committee, which was literally a committee of people from various diaspora communities who would pay into a pot, and that would be anything from like 70p to £1 a week. And they would kind of raise this money within their community to put down payments on properties so that you might have a stake in your local
Mm.
community. And you could buy this property, and it might sort of also act as like a meeting house for community meetings. All this money might go for translation services so people could better advocate for themselves with their local housing association, and so on and so
Mm.
forth. And so, there's lots of reasons why these might not exist anymore. The kind of idea that these are not financially feasible, the idea that government interventions made it more and more difficult to, have these kind of these community networks. Um, there's countless reasons, but what it reminds us to do is that what it reminds us of is that community has always been a grassroots place that brings us together, that we can learn from, how alive the archive is and what we can learn from today. And what we see is tenants unions, small grassroots community organizations are doing that work of translation, of teaching people about admin, of learning about bailiff resistance, about doing small things to keep each other safe and look after people who live near us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that we're having this conversation after obviously yesterday there was the settlement for the Grenfell Tower incident. And, obviously it's just like a symbol of just complete systemic neglect and such deep lack of understanding. So why are there no real checks with councils and developers who are actually building these like terrible structures?
Well, this is the question, isn't it? I mean, I reported at Grenfell on the fire at Grenfell during the time, and then, obviously I write about it in the book, and I speak to some tenants who were in temporary accommodation in hotels
God.
in West London, for 2-3 years. And it really speaks to the negligence of Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council. It speaks to the sort of negligence braided into the whole system, not only of the specific case, but of social housing at large. And even during the Grenfell inquiry, as I was watching it and reporting on it, I was completely taken aback with the disrespect that, you know, ex residents were treated with. Victims of trauma were being called aggressive, people who were advocating for their own rights, for their own safety, for, fire doors, they closed properly, were really demonized by various powers that be. And it just tells us such a story about how power dynamics exist in our current housing structure, and also the way in which homeowners and social housing tenants and landlords and estate agents have all been trained to see themselves as separate interest
Mm,
groups. We know that the housing crisis is intersectional. We know that this is all
mm.
interconnected. We know that this affects all of us equally. But this government and governments over the last 10 years have encouraged us to see ourselves as separate interest groups and to create winners of losers of the crisis. And the losers are often people who are the most vulnerable, are the most marginalized. And my book hopefully gives us ways that we can not only push back, but also delight and revere and respect communities which are so often overlooked.
Yeah, no, completely. And I definitely felt that with so much respect for those communities. I was just thinking of the Bengal housing group and things like that from the 70s and everything that they've done, just to sort of set us up. And even the Filipino housing community, which obviously is incredible. That's only one of a kind in the whole of Europe. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just kind of shocking, actually. And obviously, as you say, this is a situation where obviously things have gotten so much worse. And there is a lack of social housing because most of it's been sold off. So, how do we
Yeah.
convince governments to build more affordable homes?
Well, I think that they should stop looking at the 1980 Housing Act, enforced by Thatcher, of course, as a success story. And we know that lots of, ministers in the current government really look to Thatcher's economic policies as aspirational. So that's where I would start. But I would say that there's an absolute chronic need for more social rented housing
Mm,
to be built in this country, and not only to be built, but to be built at good quality and at scale.
yeah.
We have a crisis of disrepair, of structural issues, of our housing stock, obviously being the oldest in Europe, and that making it more prone to structural issues and damp and mold. We need to build new build houses with thought and care and architectural intervention, and we need to build it at scale. I mean, it needs to be truly affordable and not come under the sort of category of affordable housing when that does not mean that it is affordable to most people. So I think that that is the place to start. I would also like to obviously see things like housing registers.
Mm,
I would like people to be able to advocate for their own health
yeah.
adequately by accessing legal aid for disrepair claims, which is no longer possible. So there are things that we want to see change. And there are also things that, you know, are kind of like sometimes shrugged off as like, oh, left wing utopian fantasy, like rent caps, which only only existed in the
Yeah.
1980s. They're very much part of our contemporary history. These can work. We know that rent pressure zones are being rolled out in Scotland, and there are lots of conversations about this. We know that there are examples of rent strikes really
Mm,
working. We know that there is pushback. We know that there is resistance, but ultimately we know that we cannot we cannot continue like this. We're in a public health emergency, and that's not even to talk about the cost to Treasury for an aging population who are housing insecure. I mean, where are we going to be, and who is the crisis working for?
yeah, completely. And and that also reminds me of the fact that you spoke about gentrification, which is like
Mm.
destroying our communities. So, how do we stop this from actually happening?
Well, I think it's important to level our frustration in the right direction,
Mm.
right? We know this is a structural issue. We know that this is government not regulating private property developers, and these change the face of our local
Mm.
communities hugely, you know. But sort of when I'm writing about gentrification in the book, I'm writing about what this shift to community does to us, and for us to really see and really reckon with what that means and how we can navigate that.
Mm.
The writer Clint Smith
Mm.
writes about the importance of putting our bodies in the places where history happens. And, that's what I've obviously done in this book. But when it comes to gentrification as a specific issue, that is what we have to do. We're putting our bodies in the place where history is happening in real time. We're seeing change outside of our
Yeah.
doors. So we need to recognize that the places that we live are connected to our front doors, to our street, to our neighborhood, to our local borough, to our country. This change has a huge impact on all of us. What can we do to make sure that locals aren't priced out of a local environment? What can we do to make sure that there isn't this kind of divide and
Mm.
conquer
Yeah.
sort of economic approach to locals and new people who have moved in? How do we make sure we're building in respect for local communities and making sure that local communities have a say?
Yeah.
And there's historical precedents for this. I write in the book about, brick picnics or bricknicks in the Bangladeshi community where, white upper middle class architects enlisted members of predominantly women to build the Women's Centre. They enlisted these women to go around London and do etchings and rubbings of specific bricks so that they could have a conversation, have a language to talk about the bricks that they wanted
Mm.
their women's centre to be built in. They had a say. There was this kind of conversation and intervention where the building that ended up getting built was the product of a two-way
Mm.
conversation, and people felt like they were able to have a real language to advocate for it every step of the way. There are ways to include community in changes that happen to your locale, and this is something we need to think about. I'm somebody who has, made a life happen between the cracks of a historical housing crisis. And I've lived in a range of housing stock. I've lived in a range of areas, in London and across the UK and in the countryside. And it is very clear to me that the issues that we're talking about are
Yeah.
national and global. Rural gentrification is as damaging as the gentrification I write about in South London and in urban centres. Scotland and Wales and North and Ireland are having chronic
Mm.
stress on their housing market. The fight for clean air impacts all of
Yeah.
us. So when it comes to everything from accessibility to green space to the way that we decorate our interiors, all of this tells us something about how we live in Britain today
Mm.
and what we can ask for to maintain more optimistic, positive futures, but also how we can really look around and see the country that we live in for what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in your own personal experience, obviously, having been all around different places in the UK, I'm like, what was the effect of not being settled on you? And, especially with the threat of bailiffs. And obviously, you had a strange conversation with a bailiff. But, what was that effect? Did it make you sort of just always kind of flighty when you were older?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I talk about it in the book as experiencing, lots of mini griefs each time, I leave a different place and, I'm in mourning for it immediately. And so I think it's definitely made me more sentimental as a
Mm.
person. I just am by nature. The book is a little sentimental in places. Um, and those kind of early traumas, when I was younger, kind of anticipating the arrival of a fabled bailiff, that came out in various ways. I had various anxieties. I ate a lot of Nutella toast on the step with my mum to kind of calm my nerves. I, had various issues committing to jobs and various
Mm.
other things in my life. And so, you know, to feel so out of control because of issues of state, issues of structure, issues of structural positioning and economy, it's really tricky. And when I was younger, I tried to negotiate with my mum all the time. Oh, if I do this, can we stay here? If I stay there for a bit, can we stay here? By the time I was in my mid-20s, there was no one to negotiate with apart from landlords and estate agents, and they did not have my best interests at heart. And so, I think it's a long-term process of thinking about how we navigate that. But it also enables me to really see, when I see home ownership being sold to me as a luxury on specific Instagram accounts, when I see, buying a home and renovating it packaged to me as making it
Yeah.
or an aspirational lifestyle, not only do I know to resist, but I know that that is not the experience of everybody in this country. And while I'm not kind of individually judgmental about the specific people who were doing that, I know that it speaks to a larger issue. And my hope is my book is a contribution to a wider conversation about housing where we can really get into this and really unpack it. And we can really say people are treated very different by the housing system. When you are on a list for social housing, you are not even half the time granted an image of the place that you're going to live
No.
in, versus estate agents who have very lucrative businesses, photoshopping images, taking high res, slick, shiny images of houses to go on Zoopla. So even at that point, the way that you're entering the market is so different, and different people are catered to so completely different. And I think it helps all of us to be transparent and aware of that.
Well, thank you, Kieran. I really appreciate it because it did mean a lot to me because I had that feeling, especially at the end where I was just like, yeah, I'm in a different place now, but still, yeah, exactly. I have a responsibility. So I think you're right. Everyone has a responsibility in this situation, especially the MPs are all landlords and who have second houses, I would say.
I would say too.
Again, Kieran, huge thanks for speaking with me today. It was such an important conversation and such an important topic, and so many people are going through this right now. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. And I'm so glad that you liked the book and it resonated with you. And yeah, great.